Over 100 years have passed since thousands of people used to live on this piece of land. Once home to men, women, and children. But little remains now of a town that so many people called home. In a period where people were separated by race, this town pushed past it. Some people have called it a utopia, others a haven. This is the story of how an Iowa town grew, prospered, and disappeared. Before airplanes, before cars, there were trains. And in the late 1800s, the nation was rapidly expanding. In the last 3 decades of the century, 170,000 miles of train tracks were laid down. America ran on trains, and trains ran on coal. And coal came from the mines.
Coal needed to be mined, and you needed workers to mine it, and so it brought people from various states around the country to mine that coal.
It was the beginning of the 20th century. America was healing from the scars of the Civil War, and states were mending after being split in two over slavery. Iowa had become a state only 15 years before the war and had immediately outlawed slavery.
As a union state, Iowa was very pro-union and sent more Union soldiers to fight in the war, more soldiers, period, to fight in the war than any other state, both in the Union and in the Confederacy. And so after the war, there was a big emphasis in Iowa, as in the rest of the country, in honoring soldiers.
The booming coal industry brought many job opportunities for men looking for work, especially after the war. Southeast Iowa, in particular, had a surplus of coal. And in the 1870s, a man named H.W. McNeil was taking full advantage of it. He owned 4 area mines, which he called Muchakinock. As profits soared, he decided to take his business a step further.
When the McNeils first started Consolidation Coal Company, that's when they had amassed 5 different coal companies in the south central Iowa, and they formed them, merged them all together into Consolidation Coal Company.
By 1900, it was one of the largest coal operations in Iowa. But it wasn't smooth sailing for McNeil. His workers were demanding higher pay and eventually went on strike.
There were a lot of different strikes, railroad strikes, coal mining strikes, workers, fighting for equal work rights or better work rights throughout the country. And so those things happened here in Iowa as well.
Unable to make an agreement with the workers who were searching for more money, McNeil still needed people to keep the mines running. He then began looking for workers out of state, especially in the South. Often, those strikebreakers were African American. Recruiters went to several states trying to get workers for the mines, including Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky, to recruit African Americans back to Iowa to work for the coal company.
It was almost like a career fair in a way, in that they would put this ad saying, colored men, come work to Iowa. And the recruiters that were with Consolidation Coal Company would go to Virginia as well, or Missouri, and they would pass out flyers as well to where black men congregated looking for jobs or opportunities. And they would say, come to come to the Virginia Hotel and meet with McNeil. And then if he wants you, you're on a train back to Iowa the next week to start working.
McNeil's success caught the eye of the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad. He sold his company for $500,000, leaving McNeil and his investors hunting for new business ventures. Coal was abundant all across Iowa, and McNeil saw a new opportunity in northern Monroe County. With this new venture, African American miners saw the opportunity for more work. Where little, if anything, existed before, a company town began to take shape. A man named J.E. Buxton was brought on board as the town superintendent. He soon handed the job over to his son, Ben Buxton, a man who quickly became a predominant figure in shaping the town. From there, Ben Buxton made the town his own, designing everything from the ground up. thinking of everything from stores and recreation for families, giving the town a more personal touch that other towns didn't have at the time. The town was desegregated from its very beginning. Anyone, black or white, was welcomed.
The Buxton family were humanitarians, and we don't know a lot about that.
Buxton's beliefs about race is one of the greater mysteries of the town. There is no indication in his history as to why he was so adamantly supportive of equality, and so miners began migrating to Buxton. Many of them would find a place unlike any they'd ever been. Following success with mines across Iowa, H.W. McNeil was setting up a new coal town in northern Monroe County named Buxton. Men and their families traveled to their new home, and what they found was unlike most towns in the early 20th century. For those living and working in Buxton, there was racial equality across the board. While the coal mine wasn't in the town, thousands of people still called Buxton home with one goal in mind: harmony. From the moment Buxton was founded, it was built on integration and equal opportunities for both black and white people. Ben Buxton made sure his black residents were treated equally when it came to their white neighbors.
You had management, you had leaders saying, this is the way it's going to be. And certain residents had said that they were told if you could not accept that, your kids were going to be going to a school with black and white children and taught by black and white teachers, your neighbors might be black or white. If you could not accept this, you were not welcomed or encouraged to stay in this town. All of this was not the norm. The country at that time, and Iowa at that time, was extremely segregated, and you would not have had blacks and whites interacting like that.
In the first decade of the 20th century, black residents of Monroe County made up less than 10% of the population. But in Buxton, 2,700 African Americans lived with an estimated 2,000 white people. Life in Buxton appeared to be peaceful. A place to raise a family, to build a home. And while the town was run by the company didn't control things in the town like schools and churches. Buxton vaulted beyond what a coal company town could be. And at its peak, Buxton had 11 churches, 3 elementary schools, and a high school.
They developed, in many ways, a utopian community. They hired an architectural firm, then based in Des Moines, to design a high school, to provide the design for churches, for 2 YMCAs, and they were able to use those plans to build the downtown area and the high school. Many towns didn't have high schools in those days.
Residents at the time have said they had everything in Buxton, including teachers, doctors, dentists, and their own store owners. Many African Americans who came from the South experienced equal opportunity for the first time. It was uncommon for Buxton residents to have large houses. Residents in Buxton had the option of buying, renting, or even building their own home. While residents had the option, many seemed to know that the town's lifespan was limited, and once the coal was out, they would be too. So many chose to rent. Consolidation Coal had company housing for those living and working in Buxton. The average cost of a rented home was about $7. The homes were spacious, 2-story homes complete with a patio and an upstairs bedroom. But Michelle Taylor Frazier's family was not the norm, even in a town as unique as Buxton.
Most people lived in tract homes that were by the coal company, and my family bought their land and they were able to build their own home. And that was something that was rarely done by African Americans because they did not have the resources.
Because of the opportunities her family had in Buxton, they saw mounting success.
With my grandfather working as a coal miner, my grandmother was an entrepreneur. So she sold clothes, she made different breads and foods.
Earning enough money to build their own home instead of renting.
This house was famous because they called it the house with the 7 gables. and that's what it was known by.
While it may have been a community for those who worked in Buxton, after work, they enjoyed robust work lives.
Every Sunday, my great-grandmother would use the money that she earned to help cook dinners for people to come over and have dinner on the lawn. They'd have people come over to their house every Sunday and eat. And so they would cook for anybody that wanted a meal. And they'd come and eat and visit and talk.
Michelle says these homes were more than just a roof over her family's head, but one for opportunity.
It was the first opportunity for African Americans to have a great lifestyle. It was an excellent, excellent opportunity.
Buxton provided other ways for its residents to prosper.
They had entertainment at the YMCA. They had a library. They had a well-known Buxton Wonders baseball team and basketball team.
The Wonder Sports team was sponsored by the Consolidation Coal Company. Newspapers from the time show the Wonders traveled to Chicago, Kansas City, and Birmingham, Alabama to play. Traveling to the other cities, the contrast between Buxton and most of America was striking. Even just outside of Buxton's borders, Black people faced discrimination, threats, and sometimes violence.
There were residents talking about even, driving through Beacon and, Black people had to duck on the train because rocks and rocks would be thrown at them. There were sundown towns in Iowa.
It was a stark reminder that not every town was as welcoming as Buxton.
For Ku Klux Klans marching in Knoxville and in Des Moines and some other towns in central Iowa. But as I always say, they didn't have the courage to show their white sheets in Buxton.
But as the 1920s closed in, the thousands of people living in Buxton had no idea that their time in the town was nearing its end. For many residents, Buxton was a utopia free from the racial discrimination that plagued much of Iowa. But as Buxton neared the start of a new decade, the Roaring '20s, a new roar was becoming more and more popular on the railroads that crisscrossed America. A roar that would signal the end of coal for the railroads. Diesel. It was a much better energy source for trains. As a liquid, it was easier to transport, and diesel burned cleaner and longer than coal. At the same time, cars were becoming more and more popular, requiring petroleum, and America's need for coal began to decline. Buxton had thrived for over 2 decades, but as the energy shift took over America, Consolidation Coal Company saw the end of the line in sight. It began shutting down mines. Without coal, without livelihood, people began to leave Buxton and search for their next job. Some records say the town was completely empty by 1923. To this day, one thing that stays with Michelle is her family's inability to purchase their family home before it was destroyed.
It was really disrespectful to the history of Buxton.
Michelle was never able to see her family's home and says it was demolished along with the many others that sat on the land when residents moved out.
It just makes you wonder, more and more about it. And I can't imagine that it wasn't interesting enough history to keep record of it. I mean, it could have just been everything got old and, they just let it go. But why was it let go? Why wasn't it taken care of, and why wasn't it valued as a historical site? I don't know.
For other African American families looking for a new home, they were suddenly reminded that not all towns were as welcoming as Buxton.
They had come from slavery, or families who had been enslaved, to this utopia, and then they stepped back 100 years. Whereas many of the white miners, where they may have left famines and poverty in Ireland or Cornwall, came to Buxton, led a good life, and stepped out, and most of them were able to either step out at the same level or step up.
As for Ben Buxton, after Buxton's decline, he returned to Illinois. A newspaper article dating back to April 24, 1933, the Rutland Daily Herald reported that Ben Buxton had died from influenza. The article briefly mentions his efforts in Buxton, saying only a town was named after him and his father. Michelle's family lived in Buxton until it began its decline in the 1920s, spending the remainder of their lives in Des Moines. With the last mine closed in 1927, Buxton was officially a ghost town. Today, the Buxton townsite land still exists. It's now privately owned, and the existing homes and almost all pre-existing structures have been removed or have been lost to time. There's not much left.
That area that you're looking at, almost that whole cleared area there, is almost all of what the downtown area would have been. There would have been houses there too, because if you looked at the pictures, since it was unincorporated, you had, the YMCA, the Boys Y, the company store, those were the big buildings, and then you had houses there, and then you had some where they kept horses, and then you had blacksmiths, so you had some supporting businesses that supported the company's business there as well. Yeah. So all of that area that's cleared is kind of that main, downtown, I like to say, area.
The land is owned by Jim Kegel, who himself was born and raised in southeast Iowa.
It seems funny to me that we got the ground in 1949, and there was still a lot of the buildings intact, and at that time there was no interest in it. Nobody cared what happened to it. Now that things are starting to deteriorate and the buildings are falling in, and now we have all kinds of interest in it.
The Buxton land has sat in silence for decades, but its memory is embedded in the heartland, with many artifacts from the site still in Iowa. Thousands of pieces of Buxton sit in the halls of Iowa State University, picked up in an archaeological dig in the 1980s, led by David Gradwell. Still, more artifacts are preserved at several museums, including the Nelson Pioneer Farm in Oskaloosa and the Monroe County Historical Society in Albia.
People will call and say, they'll call the museum and they'll say, hey, we had a grandparent that lived in Buxton and we would like to go out there, and just taking people out there and showing them where their grandparents lived or where their roots were. And I guess that's what I get the most enjoyment out of.
For years, many people have returned to the Buxton town site to remember their family members. And many join together as sort of a reunion on the grounds that they came from, remembering a town that was founded on equality that grounded so many of the people that came from here. What remains of Buxton sits in Monroe County as a piece of history.
It's hard to believe that such a town existed there at that time, and all of this was going on, and it was so progressive, and you had, so many African American leaders and people that were, doing things and making a great living, that you had that right here in Iowa is just, I think people are fascinated by that it was so ahead of its time, and it was right here, literally in the middle of farmland.